welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being here. And thanks to our speakers, as well as today's sponsors, Lacework and Beyond Trust, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director at Redmond Magazine, and I'm so excited to moderate our second session of our Ransomware Training Summit. This session is called Strategies for Implementing Simulation Training. And you're in for a treat, as Ian and Chris indicated at the last session. Today's speaker for the second session is Brian Posey. Brian is a freelance tech writer, a 22-time Microsoft MVP, and a prolific writer of IT books, video training courses, and blog posts. If you check out redmondmag.com, there's a huge archive of Brian Posey how-to articles under the, I think it's called Posey's Tips and Tricks column on redmondmag.com. You're in for a treat. Like I said, Brian, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Gladys. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about all kinds of fun stuff. Phishing messages, ransomware simulation training, all kinds of things like that. Before I jump into it, I just want to say that I caught about the last 20 minutes of the previous session, and absolutely great stuff. Ian did a fantastic job, and there was one point that he made that I'm not going to bring it up quite yet, but I'm so glad that he made it because it's actually something that I had planned on talking about a little bit later in my presentation. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. One of the things that I find perhaps the most interesting about phishing attacks is that they never seem to go away. I mean, if you think about way back to the early 90s, phishing attacks existed back then. Now, they weren't called phishing attacks at the time, but they absolutely existed. And I can't tell you the number of times over the years that I've heard different industry leaders say, oh, we're going to put an end to spam, we're going to put an end to phishing attacks because we've got this new technology that's going to be able to detect it better and eliminate it, so this will be a problem of the past. And even after all of these years, we're talking about 30-plus years here, the problem still exists. Some of the attacks that we see today are almost identical to the ones from way back when, but of course, we see new and unique attacks every day. The one thing that I've really learned over the years is that cyber criminals will go to absolutely any length that they have to go to victimize someone. Absolutely nothing is beneath them. So how far will they go? Well, let me show you on this next slide. And before I reveal the slide, let me just say that what you're about to see is 100% real. So this is an email that I received, and the first thing that you'll probably notice is that I've redacted big portions of it. And the reason why I've redacted this isn't because I've got something to hide or anything like that. It's just to protect the privacy of the people involved. Because what this particular cyber criminal did was they went and they pulled a real obituary off of the internet, and then they embedded a couple of malicious links, and then sent it out to anybody that they thought might fall for it. So think about this for a second. In addition to being pure evil, this is one of those things that people are very likely to fall for because their guard's let down. I mean, put yourself in the position of someone who receives an email like this. Imagine for a moment that a friend, relative, loved one, or someone close to you ended up passing away, and you received a copy of their obituary by email. You probably wouldn't suspect anything. I know I wouldn't. When I received this, thankfully, there were some telltale clues, and I didn't fall for this and click on anything that I shouldn't. But this is one of those things that would be extremely easy for somebody to fall for. And yet, here we have cyber criminals doing this, exploiting someone's death in order to infect someone with malware. So all of this is to underscore the point that cyber criminals will go to absolutely any lengths to victimize someone. So that's all the more reason why you have to take these phishing attacks seriously, in addition to the simple fact that they're the most prolific type of attack that we face today. So how do we deal with this sort of thing? Well, filtering is an absolute must. That's a given. That one's so obvious I'm not even going to be addressing it in this presentation. But the problem with filtering is that it's never going to be 100% effective. There's always going to be something that gets through the filter, and that's what you have to deal with. So what should you do to deal with it? Well, I recommend taking a two-pronged approach. One of those prongs is end-user education, which is something I consider to be extremely important, but also something that's not done nearly enough. And then the other thing is attack simulation training, and I'm going to be talking about both of these. So let's start by talking a little bit about end-user education. when it comes to end user education, I recommend not underestimating the importance of just having a very frank and detailed conversation with your users and giving them the information that they need in order to be able to avoid these phishing messages. Because remember, your users can benefit from this. Not only are phishing attacks prevalent at work, but this is something that they have to deal with at home too on their personal email accounts. So you're not only helping the company to avoid a massive ransomware attack or something like that, you're also helping your users in their own personal lives to avoid being compromised. Another way to look at this is that it's going to be a whole lot cheaper and a lot easier to educate your users than to clean up the mess following a ransomware attack or some sort of malware attack or other type of security breach. Because anytime that data is disclosed and leaked out on the internet, it's extremely expensive to clean up from that. So it's going to be way cheaper, way easier just to educate your users up front than to have to incur the cost involved in cleaning up from a massive security breach. So another bit of advice that I would give you is to take advantage of all of the various tools that are out there. Yes, I'm talking about attack simulation training, but there are countless other tools available. There are some fantastic resources that are available online that can coach you through the process of avoiding phishing emails and that can help you to get your users trained. So with that said, I'm going to spend the next portion of the presentation talking about some things to look for in phishing messages. Now, I realize that the vast majority of you who are listening are IT professionals, and a lot of this is probably old hat to you, and that's great. That's a fantastic position to be in. The reason why I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over things to look for in phishing emails is two things. One, it's for the benefit of anybody who might be new, but two, and perhaps more importantly, after this presentation is done, all of these slides are going to be available for you to download. I'm not exactly sure where. I'm sure Gladys can fill you in at the end of the presentation, but all of this is going to be available for download. So the content that you'll find in my next several slides are things that you're going to be able to take back and use to develop your own end-user training program. So that's why these are in here. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So every phishing attack, as I'm sure most of you probably already know, consists of two parts. First of all, there's the message, and the message is deceptive by its very nature, and it's designed to trick the recipient into taking some sort of action. And that action is related to the other part of the message, which is the payload. The payload is almost always either going to be a malicious link or it's going to be an attachment. So what I find particularly interesting is that most cyber criminals will go to great lengths to disguise the payload, and that's what I'm going to be showing you is some of the methods that are used for disguising payloads. Every great once in a while, you may find a cyber criminal who gets lazy and does absolutely nothing to disguise the payload. I've certainly seen a couple of examples of that over the years where they don't even try to hide the fact that they're trying to infect you with something. But most of the time, they'll use some sort of obfuscation to disguise the payload and make it seem like something, at the very least, that's harmless, but potentially even beneficial to you. So let's take a look at some examples. One of the big ones, and this is one of those techniques that's been around absolutely forever, but it's still in use today, is fake file extensions. So let me show you how this works. Fake file extensions are something that, to the best of my knowledge, happens primarily in Windows environments, and it takes advantage of the fact that newer Windows operating systems hide file extensions by default. So if you take a look at the slide, you can see that I've got a file called My Document, and there is no extension on that. And the reason why there's no extension is because, as I mentioned, Windows hides file extensions by default. You'll also notice on this slide that there's a big blue arrow pointing to a checkbox for various things that you can do to customize the appearance of File Explorer. So we have item checkboxes, file name extensions, and hidden items. So if you were to select that file name extensions checkbox, then the file name extension would show up. So you can see on this slide what happens when I select that checkbox. All of a sudden, instead of seeing My Document, we see mydocument.txt or .text. Simple enough. So let's take a look at how this gets exploited. Here I have another file called mydocument.txt. Now, there are two things that I want to point out about this. First of all, if you look at the blue arrow, you'll notice that the file name extensions checkbox has not been selected. So in creating this particular file, the person's taking advantage of the idea that Windows files can have multiple extensions. Those extensions simply get appended to one another. So in this case, we have mydocument.txt, and then there's presumably something that comes after that that's hidden because file name extensions are turned off. The other thing that I wanted to point out on this slide is the icon, because a lot of times the icon is a dead giveaway as to what you're really dealing with. So if I would go back to the previous slide for a second, take a look at the icon that's associated with mydocument.txt. The file that's shown on this slide is a real text file, and the icon conveys that. If I go to this slide, however, you'll notice that the icon has changed, and now the icon represents an executable. So if we turn on file name extensions, you can see that the full name of this file is actually mydocument.txt.exe. So this is an executable file as opposed to the harmless text file that it masquerades as. So that's just one technique that cybercriminals will sometimes use to disguise payloads. Let's take a look at some others. Another thing that's super common is long domain names. So the basic idea behind this is that a URL is made up of a domain and several different subdomains. So for example, .com would be a top tier domain, and then beneath that you would have typically the organization's name, and then beneath that you might have like www or something like that. But there are any number of different ways that you can construct a domain made up of multiple subdomains. So attackers will often take advantage of this technique and make it look like a URL is going to one place, where in reality it's going to somewhere else. What they will often do is make the domain name so long that they're counting on it being long enough to extend past the visible portion of the address bar in your browser, if that's how you're entering it, or make it look entirely uninteresting within the context of an email, so that you can't tell where this link is really going. Another really common technique is spoofed URLs. And this is one of those things that's super simple to do. If you've ever hyperlinked a piece of text, you know how to do this. All you do is whatever program you're using, you select the word that you want to hyperlink, right-click on it, and then typically there will be an option to hyperlink, and then you type in the URL that you want to use. So what this technique is based on is taking a pure plain text URL and hyperlinking it, but rather than hyperlinking it to the URL that's shown, hyperlinking it to somewhere else. So for example, in this case, I've taken the URL brianposey.com and I've hyperlinked it to poseylab.com. So even though this says brianposey.com, if you clicked on it, it would go to poseylab.com instead. And that's an extremely common technique. And I mentioned how you could do something like this using a text editor. If you're just creating raw HTML, it's even easier to do, because all you have to do is insert a meta tag directing the code where you want the link to go to. Another technique that's often used by cyber criminals is that of shortening URLs. And there are several different services online that will do this for you. The two most common are probably tinyURL or Bitly. The basic idea behind these services, and these are totally legit services, by the way, I shouldn't add that, but the basic idea behind these services is that if you've got a big long URL and you just want to shorten it so that people don't have to type so much text, you can go out to tinyURL or to Bitly, you type your great big long URL, and then they give you another URL that acts as an alias. So this much shorter URL is something that people can use to get to the site that you're trying to direct them to without having to type in the longer URL. And as you can see on this slide, these short URLs are really cryptic in nature. So my long URL example is brianposey.com/space, but the aliases that I generated on that are tinyurl.com/y3lh5ayx and bit.ly/31sxsp3. So the reason why I mention this is because you can't just look at one of these shortened URLs and get a sense of where it goes to. You don't know where this is going to ultimately direct you once you click on one of these URLs. Sure, it's going to go out to tinyURL or to Bitly, but then from there it's going to get redirected somewhere else. And that somewhere else is a complete mystery. So this is one of those techniques that cyber criminals will very often use. Another really common technique is simple misspellings of URLs. I've given a few examples here, but this is far from being a comprehensive list. In the first example, we have posylabs.com as opposed to posylab.com. So the URL has an extra S. So this looks like the legitimate site, but that one extra character makes all the difference in the world. We also have posylab.com misspelled. You'll notice that posylab.com is missing the E. So a simple misspelling or character omission. Another really common technique that's used is to just transpose two characters. So for example, in my name, Posey, P-O-S-E-Y, they might type P-O-E-S-Y instead as a way of redirecting someone to a different site without them catching the mistake. And then there are also just simple misspellings. For example, my first name is spelled with an E. A cyber criminal might use an A instead of an E as a way of directing someone to a site that's not mine. So those are just a few examples. And then we have hidden URLs. This is a variation of the technique that I talked about earlier, in which a word is hyperlinked and it's directed to a different location. So in this case, I have click here to go to your bank's website, but the word here isn't actually hyperlinked to a bank. It's hyperlinked to a different destination. And the way that you would detect this is to simply hover your mouse over top of the hyperlink, and that will show you where the URL actually goes to. And that was the case with the example that I gave before as well. Now, one of the things that you need to be aware of with regard to this technique is that it's not always applied just to text. The same basic technique can also be applied to things like buttons. So let me show you a real-world example of this. Here we have a URL that I received probably a couple of weeks, or excuse me, an email that I received probably a couple of weeks ago. And this email claims to be from DocuSign. And at first glance, it legitimately looks like it's from DocuSign. There are a few things that are a dead giveaway within this email, but the one thing that I really wanted to point out more than anything else is that there's a great big button that says View Document, and if you hover the mouse over top of the button, you can see that the URL that's associated with that button doesn't point to DocuSign. Instead, it goes to some really obscure URL, r20.rs6.net, whatever that is. So clearly this is a malicious message. So what are some other giveaways that were in this indicating that this message probably wasn't from DocuSign? Well, for one thing, the simple fact that I wasn't expecting anything from DocuSign. Typically, when someone sends you a document that they want you to sign, they'll let you know about it ahead of time. And I didn't receive any such notification. So that's one tip-off. But another tip-off is just a few things that exist within this message. For example, there's an option to translate message to English, and then there's also a link, never translate from Dutch. I don't know anybody who speaks Dutch that would be sending me a document to sign, so that's kind of a giveaway too. Also, if you look at who it's from, it's coming from peaksepticandutilities.com. So that sender is also kind of a giveaway. Not that they're necessarily rogue or something like that, but clearly this document spoofed the sender, or clearly this email spoofed the sender rather. So what else? The next example says vague attachments. The slide should probably say vague emails and attachments, because one of the techniques that's often used is that of just making a message so vague that the recipient doesn't really know what to do with it, and so they kind of get curious and click on something that they shouldn't. So in this case, and this is a real email, the subject, ACH confirmation attached. For those who aren't familiar with ACH, I believe it stands for Automated Clearinghouse, and the idea is that there's some sort of electronic payment that's been made, and this email is apparently the confirmation of that. But you'll notice that there's absolutely no text in the email telling the person what to do. The only thing in there is an attachment, and that attachment is an HTML document. So if someone were to click on this attachment, it would open up their browser and direct them to who knows where, presumably to some malicious site. But the point being that this message is so incredibly vague that they're counting on the idea that whoever receives it is going to have questions. They're not going to know if this is actually an ACH confirmation or not, and they might think that they should open up this attachment just to be sure. So that's one of the things that you've really got to educate your end users about. So let's talk about some of the different payload types. There are any number of different types, and this is by no means an all-inclusive list. If we were to talk about all of them, I would probably burn up every bit of time that I've got just talking about the various types of payloads. So at the top of the list, we have ransomware. Ransomware has become somewhat of a generic term over the years because there are so many different types of ransomware. So the next thing on the list is ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service is something that's come about, I don't know, maybe in about the last 5 years. The idea is that there are cyber criminals out there who want to launch ransomware attacks but don't have the skill to create ransomware themselves. So what they do is they go out to the dark web, and there are providers that offer ransomware as a service. So in other words, it's do-it-yourself ransomware. The cyber criminal goes out to one of these sites, they fill in a few fields, and then this site spits out ransomware that's custom tailored to their specifications. And the way that this works is that they can use this ransomware to infect anybody they want and to extort payment, and then the author of that ransomware kit ends up getting a portion of any ransoms that are paid. So that's one way that the cyber criminals are launching ransomware attacks when they might not necessarily have the skill to do so otherwise. Then we have crypto ransomware. Crypto ransomware is probably the type of ransomware that we're all the most familiar with. This is the type that goes in and encrypts all of your files and then demands a ransom in exchange for a decryption key. The next one on the list is scareware. And this one might be best summed up as ransomware that's not real. So you might think, why in the world would anybody create ransomware that's not real? Well, there are any different number of reasons. One is you might have a cyber criminal who wants to launch a ransomware attack, but they don't really know how, so they create fake ransomware. I've also seen scareware created for training purposes. I myself have created scareware on occasion, not to unleash on the world, but just for my own purposes. For some of the documentation that I've created or things like that, I don't really want to mess around with real ransomware, so I'll create something that looks like ransomware just so that I can handle it safely. Then we have lockers. This is very similar to crypto ransomware in that it locks up a file in some way so that a person has to pay a ransom in order to gain access to their data. So these lockers, sometimes they'll use encryption. They go in and encrypt all the files just like crypto ransomware would. In other times, or in other cases, they might set up a encrypted vault and then actually move all of the files into that vault. And then you have to pay to get the password that would open that vault. So there are a million different variations of this. Another one is doxware. This is more of a cyber extortion type scheme where the cyber criminal threatens to expose personal details unless a ransom is paid. As a matter of fact, I know someone personally who was just a victim of this very recently. And then the last one on the list is leakware. And this is somewhat similar to doxware, except rather than threatening to leak personal details, the cyber criminal is in possession of data and they're threatening to expose the organization's most intimate secrets on the internet unless they pay a ransom. So let's talk a little bit about phishing attacks. Again, there are a countless variety of phishing attacks out there, but let's talk about some of the more common ones. And incidentally, over about the next 3 screens, the screen captures that you'll see all came from the Microsoft 365 attack simulation tool. So the first one on the list is pandemic-related scams. And we're not seeing this one quite as often anymore, but it's still out there. The idea is that the cyber criminal will create an email posing typically as either a government agency or as the company that a particular person works for, and they'll say something like, hey, there's huge benefits that are available to you, but in order to claim these benefits, we need you to click here and provide a few personal details. Then we have brand impersonation messages. In this particular example, there's a message that claims to come from Apple, and they're asking the person to log in to their Apple account and provide some details. There are a million variations on this one. I've even seen emails in the real world that claim to come from companies like Coca-Cola or Microsoft saying that, hey, you've won the Coca-Cola lottery, click here to claim your prize, or really bizarre things like that. The next thing that we have is shipping scams. And there are a lot of different varieties of this one. In this particular case, this is posing as a DHL parcel tracker, and the text of the email just says the document's been made available via email attachment as requested by the sender, content of parcel, shipping documents, click here to download. So The idea being that you click on a link thinking that you're going to download shipping details, and instead you get infected with malware. What I've seen more commonly in the real world rather than this, because again, this does come from the Microsoft attack simulation tool, what I've seen more commonly in the real world is a fake email that claims to come from UPS or FedEx or something like that, and says package is out for delivery today. Here's the tracking number, and oh, by the way, click here if you want to see the tracking details. And things like that you have to really be careful with, because a lot of times those messages look completely authentic. And I can't speak for any of you, but I tend to have a lot of packages delivered, and so I get UPS tracking details several times a week. And sometimes it's tough to know for sure whether one of those messages is actually from UPS or if it's one of these phishing emails. Oftentimes there are subtle telltale signs that you can use to tell the difference. But the best rule of thumb is if you're not sure, just don't click on anything. Then we have urgent messages. And again, these take on a million different forms. In this case, this message is your license plate number will expire soon. So they're trying to prompt the recipient of the message into taking some sort of action. The recipient will get this message and think, oh, my plates on my car are about to expire. I've got to renew this, and they may click on the link without even thinking about it. And then on the last couple, we have rewards programs. So you've been selected by the Fair Price Rewards Program. Honestly, I'm not familiar with Fair Price. I don't even know if that's a real thing or not. And then we also have invoices, and this is another really common one. So this example email has a subject line of remittance advice, which usually means that someone has paid you. And then it has text that within the body of the message saying, you've received a payment from so-and-so, click here to get the details. So these are just a sampling of some of the types of phishing messages that get directed at end users every single day. But as I mentioned, this is far from being a comprehensive list. There are plenty of other types of attacks. We have things like CEO fraud, where a message will appear to come from an organization's CEO and be sent out to the entire company. There are also account compromise attacks, and again, these take on lots of different forms, but this might be something like trying to capture a user's credentials so that you can log in as them. Data theft, and there are a lot of different ways of doing data theft, but if we're talking about email, then one of the more common methods is to either compromise an account so that you can log in as an end user, or just spoof that user's email address, send a message to somebody else in the company and say, oh, hey, by the way, can you send me such and such file? I need that for my records, and then try to gain access to data that way. And then there's also attorney impersonation. Somebody sends out an email message claiming to be an attorney working for the company that they work for and requesting access to certain data or asking personal questions. It's kind of a social engineering scam. But this is one of those things that's been showing up quite a bit more in the real world recently. So here's an example of one of these types of attacks. Here's a message, and this is a type that I've been seeing a whole lot recently. So here's a message claiming to come from Bank of America. And it says, Bank of America guard shared an item. And it says, Bank of America has shared the following item, and then there's a button that you can click to open it. But if you look at the sender details on this, it says Bank of America guard via Google Drive. Now, I'm not a Bank of America customer. I don't really know how they do things, but I'm guessing they probably don't send out documents via Google Drive and ask their customers to open them. So that's kind of a dead giveaway. So what are some other potential messages that you might see? One is pre-texting, and we've covered this one several times, and that's a message looks like it's from somebody that you know. So spoofing the sender's email address. Then we have fake extortion or blackmail messages. These are messages like, hey, I've got some sort of dirt on you, and if you don't pay up, I'm going to let the world know, when in reality they don't actually have anything that they can use for extortion purposes. They're bluffing, hoping that somebody will pay up. And I've seen quite a few examples in the real world of this. I once had a friend, I don't want to say too much because I don't want to accidentally give away confidential information, but I had a friend who called me in an absolute panic one day because he received one of these messages. And the person that he got that message from was claiming to expose all of the stuff about him if he didn't pay up. And it just so happened that in that message they had managed to guess some of the details of his personal life and got these things correct. So he assumed that the message was real. When it comes to fake extortion or blackmail messages, the one thing to look for that you can use to figure out if it's a credible threat or not is what proof are they giving you? Because typically, if a cyber criminal does have something incriminating on you, they're going to use that as leverage. Remember, their goal is to scare you so much that you feel like you don't have any choice but to pay up. So they're going to show you the proof. That's a given. If they just say, hey, I've got all of this, but they don't actually show you any of it, well, then that's probably a good indication that it's a fake extortion or blackmail scam. And then the last one on the list is deepfakes. Now, I have to admit that I didn't really take this one as being a credible threat in the past, but I was talking to someone in my family over the holidays. And again, I don't want to say too much at the risk of exposing this person, but someone had managed to compromise their Facebook account, got a hold of a bunch of personal details, and managed to create a rather disturbing deepfake video of them, and then threatened to send that video out to everyone in their contacts list. The person involved in this told me that the deepfake video didn't look 100% real, but it was real enough that anybody who casually looked at it without trying to scrutinize the video would absolutely fall for it. So apparently the deepfakes that are out there are getting better, and this is something that cyber criminals are actively engaging in. So how can we summarize all of this advice for your end users? Well, there are a few things that the Federal Trade Commission provides as advice to end users. So they say, and this is a direct quote from their website, a message from a scammer might say they've noticed some suspicious activity or login attempts. They haven't. They might claim there is a problem with your account or your payment information. There isn't. They say they need to confirm some personal or financial information. You don't. They might include an invoice you don't recognize. It's fake. They might want you to click on a link to make a payment, but the link has malware. They might say you're eligible to register for a government refund. It's a scam. Or they might offer a coupon for free stuff. It's not real. So just some things that you might pass on to your end users. So what are the most obvious characteristics of a phishing message? Well, some of the more prevalent ones are things like poorly constructed sentences, bad grammar, misspellings, and then implausible situations. I'm talking about some of the ones that have gone on absolutely forever, where someone will claim to be from a government agency and say you owe money to the IRS or the Social Security Administration, or pick your agency of choice, and we want you to pay that overdue bill with Amazon gift cards or Apple gift cards or something like that. You know, things that are totally implausible that would never happen in the real world, and yet there are scammers out there that try that. And unfortunately, there are victims who fall for that. So let's talk about attack simulation training. For anybody who's not familiar with the concept of attack simulation training, it's essentially using a tool to create a benign but realistic-looking phishing message and direct it at your users as a teaching tool, so that way you can help them to more readily be able to spot real phishing messages. So the tool that I'm going to be using throughout the rest of this presentation is the Microsoft Attack Simulation tool. That's included with Microsoft Office 365 E5, and there's a trial version of it with the E3 subscription, but I think you only get access to one message in the E3 version. So let's take a look at this tool. So this is the dashboard that appears when you first open up the tool. And there are a few things going on here. First of all, we have an overview that shows the recent simulations that you've run. There's also some recommendations. You can see the simulation coverage and the training that's been completed by your end users. But what I found more interesting is that down at the bottom, we have a list of repeat offenders, so people who have fallen for multiple fake phishing attacks. And these are the users that you probably want to target more heavily for training. And then we also have behavior impact on compromise rate. So what that means is that, okay, the first time you run a tool, or run a simulation, you'll probably have quite a few people fall for it. The next time, hopefully, they've learned their lesson and fewer people will click on it. So the way that the dashboard interprets that is that users are gradually becoming less susceptible to falling for these attacks, and they provide various metrics for quantifying that susceptibility. So here we see the dashboard simulation tab, and you can see one simulation that I've run in the past. So you can see the number of simulations that are completed, the number in progress, the ones that are scheduled to run in the future, and then other details such as failed simulations, canceled simulations, and draft simulations. So when you do set up a simulation, the first thing that you have to do is tell the tool what type of attack you want to perform. And I can't remember if I said this a moment ago or not, but there are various third-party tools out there that will also do attack simulation training, and they all offer slightly different options, but generally you are going to have the ability to pick the type of attack that you want to direct at the end users. So here we have a few of the choices, things like credential harvesting, malware attachments, a link in the attachment, a link to malware, drive-by URLs, and the list goes on and on. So you would choose the type of attack that you want to perform, and again, these are all benign. They're not actually going to inflict any harm on anyone. And then once you've selected the attack type that you want to perform, you're given a great big long list of messages that you can use as a part of that attack, or you can compose your own message. So you have the ability to preview these messages to see what they look like. And as you can see from the screen capture, these previews are designed to mimic what you would see in the real world. So we have a message, recent server update. Kindly update to the latest security update to enhance your email functionality. Update now. And then be aware that Office 365 will not be responsible for any loss of data should this warning be neglected. So we have all of the various signs of fraud in this message, and this does mimic something that you would probably run into in the real world. So the next thing that you have to do is decide what's going to happen if someone falls for this phishing message that you're sending out. What do you want to do? Do you want to assign training to them? Do you want to ignore it? You have options. And so you can assign this training to all of your users, those who have clicked on the payload, those who are deemed to have been compromised. And then from there, you can select the training module that you want to use. So generally, with the Microsoft tool, it will provide recommendations as to what training it thinks that the user should see based on the type of phishing attack that they've fallen for. But one of the things that I find especially interesting about this particular screen is that you'll notice that there's an option to redirect to a custom URL. And the reason why I like that is because, one, it gives you the opportunity to provide your own training modules as opposed to using the Microsoft ones. Because a lot of the Microsoft training modules, while they might be effective, they tend to be like 2 or 3 minutes in length. They're not very long at all. So it's something that a user could open up, click through, and easily forget about. So if you have more comprehensive training that you would like the user to engage in, you can use this redirect to a custom URL option. And there's one other potential use for the redirection that I'll talk about at the very end of the presentation. So the next thing that we see is what happens when a user falls for the phishing attack. What are they going to see when they click on the link? So the default is they get a message that looks just like this one that says, it's okay, you're human, let's learn from this. And then there's a section, learn what you missed. And then once the user sees what it is that they messed up on in the training or in that message, then they'll be taken to the mandatory training that you've assigned. So this is what it looks like when the simulation walks them through what they missed in the message. So in this case, we can see that there is URL hyperlinking, and it says URL hyperlinking hides the true URL behind the text. The text can also look like another link. And then we also have lack of sender details. The message includes few details about the sender, such as contact information. And then there are a few other things that I didn't end up capturing in screen captures. So then the user ends up receiving an email that looks like this one that tells them that they have a training course to complete. And as you can see, this kind of underscores the point that I was making a minute ago, that these training courses are super short. This one is estimated to take 3 minutes. And this is kind of what the training looks like that the end user engages in. It's done cartoon style so as to not be overly intimidating or anything like that. And it presents the end user with a situation and then asks them what they think they should do. So as we talk about simulation training, there are a few things to consider. One of the biggest considerations, I would even go so far as to say the biggest considerations, is what should the consequences be if a user falls for a simulated phishing attack? And adding to that, what should those consequences be if the user falls for an attack more than once? Now, at the very beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that in the earlier presentation, Ian had made a point that I really wanted to expand on. And Ian's point was that when somebody falls for a phishing attack and they unleash malware, they know they've screwed up. They feel really bad about it. They're probably a little bit nervous not knowing what's going to happen to them. And Ian made the point that you can really win them over by showing kindness to that person. And I could not agree more with that statement. I talked to somebody in the not too distant past who was setting up a simulation for their organization, and they said, okay, if somebody falls for it once, they'll get a warning message from HR. If they fall for it twice, they're out of here, because at that point they're not looking out for the best interest of the organization. They're clicking on things that they shouldn't, and we just need to fire them and get them out of the organization because they're not doing us any favors. In my opinion, that's absolutely the wrong approach to take, because end users already have the perspective that the organization that they work for is not loyal to them. And in many cases, that perception is absolutely accurate. I don't dispute that at all. But you can win a user over by showing them some kindness when they're not necessarily expecting to receive that kindness. So my recommendation would be absolutely require mandatory training, because you want to have some sort of consequence when a user clicks on something. Nobody wants to sit through a training course if they don't have to. So once users learn that they're going to have to do that, they're going to be scrutinizing those messages that come in just to make sure it's not a phishing message, because they don't want to have to sit through that training session again. So that's probably going to go a longer way toward preventing phishing attacks than just about anything else that you can do. Now, another point that's made on this slide, as far as a thing that you need to consider, is can someone else override your decision? So let's say that you've decided, okay, if somebody falls for these attacks repeatedly, we're just going to subject them to more and more training. We're not going to take any kind of disciplinary action against them. You have to consider, can somebody else in your organization come in and say, oh, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to fire them the first time they fall for this. Because at that point, the entire training program may end up being out of your hands, and you may lose control of the whole thing. So just something to think about. So what are some common mistakes that are made with regard to attack simulation training? Well, one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen is launching lots of attacks up front and then not doing any more after that, presumably because the users have learned their lesson at that point, or because you get bored with the tool, or you just get busy and forget to do it. In order for attack simulation training to be effective, you need to have attacks that you're simulating on an ongoing basis. This is one of those things that once you start doing it, you should never back off. Another common mistake is launching attacks in a very predictable way. So if, for example, a user knows that you're going to launch an attack on the first of the month, every month, then they're going to be looking for that. Now, how would they know that you're doing that? Well, maybe back in November, they fell for a phishing attack, simulation that you launched, and it happened to be on the first of the month, and then they did the same thing in December, and that happened to be the first of the month. Well, then that might be an indication to them that you're going to do the same thing on January 1st and February 1st, and so there's a pattern, and they can watch out for that pattern. And as long as it's not the first of the month, they don't have to worry about it. So that's one of the common mistakes that's made. Another common mistake is using the same phishing email messages over and over. So you don't want to repeat your attacks if you can keep from it. You want to keep the attacks varied so that users never really know what to expect. If you think back to one of the previous slides that I showed you, there were a huge number of messages that you could conceivably generate and use to test your end users. So you want to make these phishing attacks as varied as you possibly can so that users don't see a particular message and say, okay, I know that one's an attack because I've seen it before. You always want to keep them on their guard. Now, the one last thing that I want to talk about is going back to something that I mentioned earlier. If I can backtrack a few slides. When I talked about setting up a simulated phishing attack, I mentioned the option that's shown on the screen, redirecting to a custom URL. And when I talked about this particular option, I mentioned it from the standpoint of directing a user to a training module that you've set up yourself, as opposed to using the built-in training modules. And that's something that you can absolutely do. However, there is another option. And I'll just say up front that this isn't something that I've seen done in the real world, but I can't think of a reason in the world why you couldn't do this. The idea is to create your own scareware and set that redirection URL to the scareware that you've created. So that way, when a user clicks on something within a message that they shouldn't click on, instead of getting that little pop-up that says, you've been phished, no harm done, you're human, let's learn from this, instead they get something more like what you see right here, where they legitimately think that they've unleashed a ransomware attack. It looks like ransomware, it acts like ransomware. There's no actual harm happening behind the scenes because it's just scareware. But there's absolutely nothing on the screen to lead the user to believe that they didn't actually unleash a ransomware attack against the organization. Something like this is going to scare the user to death. And when they realize it's not real, they'll probably breathe a sigh of relief and then hopefully never make that mistake again because you scared them so bad the first time. So just something to think about. So one more consideration, and this is something that I believe Ian had mentioned in his presentation as well, is that AI is starting to go a long way toward making these phishing attacks more believable. So I mentioned that some of the common characteristics that you would want to look for is misspellings, sentences that are poorly constructed, grammatical errors, implausible situations, things like that. Well, AI is helping cyber criminals to make those phishing messages more believable. Now, I've seen statements from some of the various AI companies saying that they're taking steps to prevent their tools from being used in this way. And I have a feeling that those statements are probably true, but maybe the technology just hasn't quite caught up yet. Because as an experiment, what I did was I went into the Microsoft Attack Simulation tool, and I just picked a message at random, and I copied the text of that message. And then what I did was I took that message, I pasted it into Notepad, and then I added a line of text above it and said, make this text more professional sounding. Then I copied the entire thing into the Windows clipboard, and I pasted it into ChatGPT. And lo and behold, I didn't think this was going to work, but ChatGPT actually took that phishing message and it made it sound more professional and more plausible. So clearly there is an ability out there for cyber criminals to leverage AI as a way of making their phishing attacks much more convincing than they might otherwise be. So with that said, I am about out of time, but I'd like to go ahead and use what little time I have left to try to answer some questions.
Great. Before we get into questions, first of all, Brian, thank you so much for, as always, a very informative session. Audience, as Brian indicated a couple of slides ago, all of his slides will actually be available to you, including the links, examples, everything in the email that we're going to send with the replay. So keep an eye on it for that email from us in your inbox. All right, Brian, first question from Jennifer is, how do we access that Microsoft Attack Simulation tool? Is there a licensing requirement?
Yeah, it's included with Microsoft 365. If you've got the E5 subscription, then you've already got it. If you've got the E3 subscription, you've got what I'll just call a light version. I believe there's like one or two different simulations that you can run. You can run them as many times as you want, but you don't have the huge variety of messages that you get with E3. And I believe that if you've got an E3 subscription, you can get the security add-on, and that will also give you access to the full-blown tool. Great.
Here's one hot off the presses from Danny. What do you do if you have users, including senior management, that is resistant to learning more about security best practices?
Oh, that's a tough one, and I've run into this one so many times. Because you're right, a lot of times the end users think of security as being your job, not theirs, or they think of security as being one of those things that just really gets in the way and keeps them from being quite so effective at doing their job. So what I would recommend doing in a situation like that is first, taking a look at the filtering that you've got in place. Make sure that you've got the absolute best message filtering that you can possibly get, because if your users are really that resistant, then the best thing that you can do is to try to keep these phishing emails out of your organization in the first place. Beyond that, what I would recommend is probably using some sort of attack simulation and scaring them to death, make them think they've done something horrible, and use that as a way of showing them the importance of not falling for these types of attacks.
Great. Just as an aside, Brian, I love your scareware idea, and maybe we can just devote a whole other summit just on that. Here we go. Prakash has a question about Copilot. Specifically, how is Copilot going to make life easy for small companies? I assume regarding creating simulation training.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I actually just got access to Microsoft 365 Copilot literally yesterday, so I haven't had all that much time to play around with it yet. But on one hand, I could see cyber criminals using that to create more convincing phishing messages, but there may be an opportunity for message recipients to use Copilot as a way of evaluating a message. Like I said, I have not had hardly any time to explore Copilot hands-on yet, but there may be an opportunity, say, within Outlook to type something into Copilot like, is there anything suspicious about this message that might signal that it's a phishing message? I mentioned earlier that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, and if you get a message and you're not sure, it's best just to leave it alone and not click anything in it. Sometimes Copilot may be able to help you make those types of decisions.
Great. This one is from Tim regarding a slide you showed earlier. What kind of cadence would you suggest to avoid training burnout?
I'm not really sure that, well, it kind of depends on what type of training burnout we're talking about. If we're talking about just pure end-user training, aside from any type of attack simulations, then, yeah, you do have to be careful about not burning out the users. But I would say at a minimum, maybe once a year, give them some sort of refresher. Ideally, I would say more frequently than that, like every 6 months. But you kind of have to base it on the feedback that you get from your end users.
Right. From Glenn, I think referring back to those Copilot capabilities that you mentioned earlier, Brian. Glenn asked, these tools based on Microsoft 365, can they be moved to a Microsoft server version running on a more inner circle device?
To the best of my knowledge, no. But having said that, there are third-party tools that you can use that you might be able to do something like that with.
Got it. Another question from Asger, again regarding cadence, training cadence. We know that there are seasons where phishing attacks ramp up. Should we also ramp up simulation training around those periods or keep it steady?
I think that's kind of up to you. What I would say is if you're going to try to ramp it up in those seasons, my advice would be try to anticipate when those seasons are and ramp up your training before those seasons actually begin, just so that way you're making your users vigilant before the real-world attacks actually start ramping up. As far as whether that's a good idea or not, your end users are probably oblivious to the fact that there are more attacks during some seasons than others, but it's not a bad idea. It's certainly something to think about.
Great. A couple more questions that we have time for. This one is from Mike. You mentioned that the obituary email contained a real obituary. What would have been the tip-off that this was a phishing email?
Yeah, there were a couple of tip-offs. The thing that really caused me to realize it was just hovering over a link, and showing that it didn't go where it claimed to go. The other big tip-off for me was the date. The date on the obituary and the date on the email were fairly far apart from one another. So that was a big tip-off. Like, normally if somebody sends out an obituary, they send it right away. So waiting that long, that was kind of an indication that something funny was going on.
Great. Let's see here. This one is from Amber. Do you believe that deepfake attacks are going to become more common as time goes on?
Yeah, I really do. There's always the chance that AI companies will do something to kind of prevent that sort of thing. But right now, AI is accelerating at such a frenzied pace that the capabilities are increasing by the day. And no matter what those capabilities are, there are always going to be criminals who are willing to exploit those capabilities for the wrong reasons. So my guess is that deepfake attacks are going to become more common, and they're going to become a whole lot more convincing than they are today.
And I think we have time for one last question. This one is from Greg. How are attack simulation tools evolving to adapt to the existence of next generation attacks?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I've seen a couple of examples of fake phishing messages that look more polished. My guess is that's how we're probably going to initially see these tools evolve. But I think it'll be really interesting to see if these tools start to latch onto things like deepfake attacks and stuff like that. Not necessarily that such a tool would create a deepfake attack, but that maybe they would try to trick a user into thinking that there was a deepfake video of them, or perform some sort of cyber extortion scheme. I've largely seen these tools stay away from that sort of thing. They tend to focus more on the corporate scenarios rather than things that would affect somebody personally. So my hope is that they'll evolve to start including those sorts of things as well.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the time we have today for this session. Thank you so much, Brian, for another great one.
Thank you for having me.
Here. Yeah, of course.